I'm both a physician and a scientist, and a long-standing member of the American Association for Cancer Research. Also called the AACR, this organization is the world's first and largest cancer research group, bringing together the greatest minds in cancer research in the quest to cure and prevent cancer. Cancer Today is the AACR's magazine for patients, survivors, and caregivers. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar today to provide you highlights from the AACR Cancer Progress Report 2017, which was released last month, and share with you an overview about the importance of medical research funding and how you can get involved in making sure we have an adequate amount. You'll be hearing from two very accomplished experts. Dr. Michael Caligiuri is president of the AACR, and Dr. George Demetri is chair of the AACR's Science, Policy, and Government Affairs Committee. Each is a superb physician scientist. You will also hear from a patient advocate who has been featured in this year's Cancer Progress Report. During the presentations, you are welcome to ask questions. You can submit them by writing them in the webinar's toolbar on the right side of your screen. We'll be answering as many questions as we can during the second portion of this webinar, and we'll post answers to a number of questions even if we can't get to them during the live part of the broadcast. We will send you a follow-up email with more information. Finally, before we get started, there are two items I want to mention. Our webinar is designed to be educational. Nothing in this webinar is intended to be or should be construed as formal medical advice of any kind. Also, opinions by the presenters are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the AACR. For our first order of business, let's share our poll results. The first question asked in 1971, there were 3 million cancer survivors in the United States. In 2016, how many U.S. cancer survivors were there? The answer, 15.5 million and growing. Question number 2 asked, despite declines in cancer death rates since the 1990s, new diagnoses are expected to double by 2030. What is the major driver of this increase in cancer cases? The answer is a greater number of people who are 65 and older. The number of people reaching 65 and older ages is expected to grow from 49.2 million in 2017 to 74.1 million in 2030. And cancer disproportionately affects this age group. Now I would like to introduce AACR's president and chair of the Cancer Report Steering Committee, Dr. Michael Caligiuri. Dr. Caligiuri is director of the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center and chief executive officer of the Arthur G. James Cancer Hospital and Richard J. Sullivan Research Institute in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Caligiuri is going to talk to us about a look at cancer progress in 2017. Dr. Caligiuri.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Great to see everyone. It's really neat, the startling statistics we have, but I mean, just taking it in your own head, think about those of you that are, say, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. Think about what we know today, what we experience. Everybody today knows someone who's living successfully with cancer or cured of cancer. And I can tell you, and Dr. Nelson, Dr. Demetri, and myself, when we were in medical school, everyone died of cancer. We didn't know anyone living successfully with cancer or cured of cancer. So just over the past 30 years, think about that and look at the data that we saw on the first slide. 15 million survivors now, and of those, 112,000 are children or adolescents. And there's been a 25% reduction in the U.S. cancer death rate. Here it is on the slide. So we've gone from 3 million to 15 million and a 25% reduction. And you're experiencing that in your lifetime. You all know, and there are probably many people on this webinar who are living successfully with cancer or cured of cancer, whereas a short while ago that was not the case. And of course, the driver for this, the key element, is cancer research. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we go from that basic research in the laboratory all the way through to just groundbreaking drugs that are allowing us this phenomenal progress. Next slide, please. So, as I say, the driver here is research. And just in this year alone, in 1 year, the FDA has approved 16 new drugs And then 8 additional drugs that have already been approved are approved for additional indications. And then further, we've had 1 new optical imaging agent which has been approved. And this is very important because it's been approved for a very deadly cancer, glioblastoma multiforme. Imaging is really, really important. I think personally one of the great technological breakthroughs that's going to lead to a vast reduction in cancer as our population ages is going to be simple, harmless, inexpensive imaging. So we think of drugs not only as those to treat cancer, but those to prevent and detect cancer as well. This kind of progress that you see with the FDA this year is truly remarkable. I mean, there have been years where there have been very few, if any, drugs approved for cancer. To see 16 drugs approved, 8 new indications, and a new optical imaging agent, phenomenal. The people you see here are beneficiaries of this amazing technologic intellectual breakthroughs. Almost every one of these patients, and so many of you likely listening, have been on clinical trials. So it's important to understand, and I'll just back up for a second, a clinical trial is where you're testing usually an investigational agent or a device to see if it might prove to be valuable, and consideration will be given for FDA approval. So the people you see in this slide and are included in our AACR annual report on cancer progress really had incredibly challenging problems for which no standard therapies were available. They enlisted on clinical trials and found remarkable results such that they're all with us. And in fact, you'll hear from one of these individuals later today. What's important to understand is it's a partnership between basic research, which you really don't see on this slide, but all those thousands and thousands of scientists, physicians, and physician scientists who work in the laboratory and in the clinic doing basic research, and then our patients willing and eligible to enlist on clinical trials. And that sum of research with patients entering on clinical trials is what's really leading us to these remarkable FDA approvals. So it really takes a whole continuum, starting from the laboratory, going all the way through clinical care. Next slide. Now, really, up until the last 10 years or so, there really were only 3 pillars, and very, very old, right? 200 years of surgery for cancer, about 100 years of radiotherapy, radiation therapy for cancer, and about 50 or 60 years for the standard chemotherapy, all of which, are very toxic. More recently, there's been an explosion of 2 additional pillars, and now they, as is indicated in this slide, they've become mainstays in the armamentarium for cancer care. And we're going to see lots and lots more research and, candidly, more FDA approvals for these forms of therapies. And they include molecularly targeted therapies and immunotherapies. And we'll chat a little bit more about this. But what's important to realize here is that in the last 35 years, we now have just an amazing array of reagents, really, be it surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, targeted therapy, immunotherapy, to target cancer in a preventative or a therapeutic strategy. Next slide, please. So just breaking a little this down, let's talk about targeted therapies right now. Imagine for a minute that you have a cancer that has a particular genetic defect within that cancer cell that really isn't found in any of your normal cells. And imagine you being able to take a pill that really went entirely through your body and out of your body, and only finding or seeing those cells with that very particular genetic abnormality, which we call mutations, attacking that cell and killing that cell. It's what we call targeted therapy, as you see here. The magic bullet, something that, is very few, if any, side effects because it's not hitting your normal tissues. It's just otherwise passing through your body. And this is the kind of the foundation for what we call precision therapy, where it precisely targets just the cancer cell that has the mutation. Now, I say imagine, but indeed there are really a number of these therapies that are now available, several of which have been FDA approved. And, they're approved for acute myeloid leukemia, they're approved for chronic myeloid leukemia, for chronic lymphocytic leukemia, but even diseases like lung cancer. We're taking a pill, we're now seeing phenomenal responses with very few side effects in patients with metastatic lung cancer who've not had or failed surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, can then take a targeted therapy, experience few side effects, and yet see a reduction and elimination of their tumor. So this is truly, truly remarkable. And they're central to the whole precision therapy initiative that you've heard all about. A good example would be, recently FDA approved, would be the drug ibrutinib for the treatment of chronic lymphocytic leukemia or the deadly disease mantle cell lymphoma. In these instances, patients very often in both diseases had to progress to, after failing traditional chemotherapy, very toxic therapies that included allogeneic bone marrow transplantation, that is, transplantation from another person's body, which in itself has a very high mortality rate, as well as the possibility of relapse. Now, patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia are taking a pill 3 times a day, and candidly, we don't know what their life expectancy will be, because for at least 90% of these patients, they've gone on for years now on this pill without any evidence of relapse. And what's further is that we've figured out the defect of the 10% that aren't responding to the ibrutinib, and there are new drugs for those coming down the pipeline. So you can see tremendous progress being made with this targeted immunotherapy. Next slide, please. The fifth and what I'll call our final pillar for now, but who knows what the future will bring, is immune therapy. Imagine for a moment where a tumor grows in your body and it can really put your immune system to sleep. I like to give the analogy where you're trying to pass through enemy lines and you're able to put everyone to sleep, how easy it would be for you to pass through the enemy lines. Indeed, that's what a tumor is able to do. We now realize through very basic research in immunology that some tumors have on their surface or secrete molecules from their cells that's kind of like an anesthesia. It puts your normal immune system to sleep so that the tumor can grow and grow and grow. And what's most important is that not only have we discovered this, what we call these molecules that put it to sleep are checkpoints, but we've now got things that can stop or inhibit the checkpoints, and they're called checkpoint inhibitors. And when they're administered, it's like an anti-anesthesia. The immune system wakes up, it sees the tumor cell that it tried to put it to sleep, and it attacks it. And so we administer these molecules largely in the form of antibody therapy. They bind to these checkpoints, they inhibit them from releasing their anesthesia, and so the immune system either doesn't go to sleep, or if it was asleep, it wakes up, it sees the tumor, and it can start eating away at the tumor. And very often in the patient, we won't see anything happen for weeks, but after several weeks and sometimes months, slowly but surely, in about 20% of patients that take these checkpoint inhibitor therapies, we see regression and sometimes complete remission of these tumors. Again, sustaining life longer than it would have been or had been with the traditional 3 pillars. What's more interesting is we've gone from one tumor type, melanoma, getting FDA approval for the checkpoint inhibitors, to more recently 8 different types of cancers that have received FDA approvals for the use of these checkpoint inhibitors. And then more recently, there's one indication where any tumor that has these anesthesia molecules, I'm calling them, these checkpoints on their surface, has FDA approval to receive a certain type of checkpoint inhibitor. So what's really neat about the immune therapy is it doesn't seem to be specific for any one type of tumor. It's more general for any tumor that has these anesthetic or checkpoint molecules on their surface. So it can be very broad for not only melanoma, but say also lung cancer and certain types of lymphoma. The same molecule, the same checkpoint inhibitor being used in all of those therapies. And then finally, perhaps most recently, there's been an FDA approval for these CAR T-cell therapies. So what is CAR T-cell? Well, CAR stands for chimeric antigen receptor, and that's when you harvest the immune cell from your own body you put a special receptor on it that recognizes the flag sitting on the tumor cell. You jack up that T cell, CAR T cell, before you put it back in, and then you put it back into the body. It finds the flag sitting on the tumor cell. It then expands, activates itself, and eliminates the tumor. This is more limited right now in the number of tumors that this has been successful. Largely, it's been restricted to B-cell malignancies, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and certain types of lymphoma. But it's very clear that there's a burgeoning business of cancer research going on where we're developing more and more CARs to go on T cells with patients with various tumors. And we're really looking forward to future FDA approvals for this CAR T cell therapy. The last thing, we can go to the next slide, I want to talk to you about big data. Because even though big data isn't a treatment in itself or a prevention strategy, the way targeted therapy, immunotherapy, chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery is, it actually is proving to be just as important. And I want to explain very briefly why and how it's important. I don't know if anybody here shopped on Amazon, but I suspect everyone has. In fact, you probably did a little shopping on Amazon earlier today. And what I find is really interesting is when I buy a book on Amazon, let's say of Mice and Men, within 1 minute, I'll get a response from Amazon that says, well, if you like Of Mice and Men, you'll probably like these 3 books. And I'll look at those 3 books and, man, it's likely that I not only liked those 3 books, I might have read one and liked them. And so how is it that I could just press an order for a book and they actually could learn something about me? Indeed, I once got an email that said, and I don't order much on Amazon, but it said, would you like to consider one of these vacuum cleaners? And I looked, and it was my vacuum cleaner. So even though I ordered a book on Amazon, they actually knew more about me than I had any idea. Why is that? Well, because they have millions and millions of people in their database. And so when I ordered Of Mice and Men, they found thousands of people that also ordered Mice and Men. And then they looked at what other books those people read, and then they found the 3 most common books, and they served them up to me. And in fact, I would like all 3 of those books. And they probably asked what vacuum cleaners those people bought on Amazon, and they served me up a vacuum cleaner, and sure enough, it's my vacuum cleaner. The point being is that with big data, you can really learn a lot about someone or something. And so in cancer research, we know that there are many, many different types of cancer. And the only way I'm really going to learn a lot about a particular type of cancer is if I can find lots of other patients with that particular type of cancer. And we know that involves not only knowing their clinical history and their pathologic, what type of tumor, but also their molecular data, what DNA mutations they have. Because everybody on this webinar might have, say, colon cancer, and maybe there's 300 people on the webinar or 400 people on the webinar. But if we all had colon cancer, the likelihood that any 50 of us had the same colon cancer at the molecular level is very, very low. We need many, many more patients with colon cancer to find those 50. But once we had those 50, we could learn a lot about how are they treated, how did they come out? Oh, this group came out well, this group didn't come out well. So it could inform the patient, the doctor, or the pharmaceutical firm as to what we need to do next if I could get people just like you. So we're all trying to build the next Amazon, and we're doing that at the AACR through Project Genie. There are others that are doing this through something called Orion, and this is incredibly exciting. And right now, Project Genie and Orion are putting their data together in something I'll talk about a little later to have this big Amazon that our physicians and scientists could build. Next slide, please. So just to cap on a few things, what I want to do here is, again, we've talked about some of the amazing progress. I want to be clear, there's a big challenge. We've got 2017, you can see 1.7 million people and cases, and then you can see it's going to go up to 2.3 million a year. So that's what's going to be diagnosed, and cancer deaths are going to be diagnosed. And earlier you read, why is it? It's because the population is aging. It is also because of smoking, obesity, and other risk factors that you can see on the next slide. What's startling is that 50% of global cancers can be prevented. Think about this, 50%. And look at what we have here and ask yourself, what are you doing and not doing that could lower your risk and the risk of people you love from getting cancer. Very, very important, impactful, and a huge area of research for the AACR. Next slide. Importantly, another barrier are what we call health disparities, meaning if we all have the same cancer, sadly, we all don't have the same outcome. That can depend on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic barriers. For example, African American men have a prostate cancer death rate that's double that for men of other racial or ethnic groups. We don't know why. Patients with cancer who are uninsured or underinsured have more than a 40% likelihood of dying of their disease than those who have better insurance. And again, why is that? Early stage ovarian cancer patients of low socioeconomic status are 50% more likely to receive recommended care than those are, 50% less likely to receive what is recommended as the standard therapy than those who have a higher socioeconomic status. So you can see here, it isn't just diagnosing cancer and treating, it's also considering who you are, where you are, your wealth, geography, etc. All of these things seem to impact and create barriers for cancer. Importantly, next slide, during my presidential initiative, I'm actually focused on this and have the AACR behind me, where we're going to actually study 2020 genomes from African American patients to see, is there a genetic basis for some of the differences that we see in the African American population compared to some of the other populations. And if this is successful, of course, we'll move on to other underrepresented populations. So I'm going to stop there. I know I might have run a little bit over, and I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Nelson, who will take us to our next section. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Caligiuri, for sharing the highlights of cancer progress over the past year. If any of you visiting this webinar today would like to read the Cancer Progress Report 2017, you can go to www.cancerprogressreport.org, where you can read the report digitally or request a hard copy. Also, remember, if you want to ask a question of Dr. Caligiuri or any of the other speakers, feel free to do so by using the toolbar and enter the questions where we're prompted on the toolbar associated with this webinar. Now I'd like to introduce to you Adrienne Skinner, one of 6 cancer survivors featured in this year's Cancer Progress Report, who comes to us from Manhattan to share her personal story and her experiences participating in a cancer clinical trial. Adrienne.
Hi, I'm glad to be here, and thanks for including me. My story is a happy one, and I'm grateful for the drug that saved my life. Next slide, please. I'll give you a little bit about who I am and then tell you what happened. I'm a 60-year-old single working mom. I live outside of Manhattan, but work in town here. And I have a genetic mutation. I was diagnosed about 12 years ago with Lynch syndrome. It actually runs on my mother's side of the family. So I knew for a while, and I had lots of testing, colonoscopies, endoscopies. Lynch syndrome is a mutation, a genetic mutation that causes a very high risk, 80 to 90% lifetime risk of digestive tract cancers. So I was very well aware of this. I did a lot of oversight, which is really all you can do in this situation, had annual colonoscopies and biannual endoscopies. However, unfortunately, what they didn't catch in this process was the cancer I was diagnosed with. In February 2013, during the blood work for my colonoscopy that was scheduled, they found that I had very high levels of liver enzymes and determined through a scan that there was a mass in the ampulla, and that turned out to be cancer. So ampullary cancer, while it's a digestive tract cancer, is extremely rare. And at that point, I scheduled for surgery. I had a great surgeon at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dr. Peter Allen, and when he went in with his team to do what is known as the Whipple, to take out the ampulla and resection me, they discovered that it had spread. So metastatic ampullary cancer, stage 4 cancer, they couldn't finish the surgery, and at that point, I had to begin chemotherapy. after enduring a year of chemotherapy to no avail. I had some progress, and then it came back. The levels were rising again. My oncologist, Dr. Eileen O'Reilly of Memorial Sloan Kettering, had found a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins. And this, next slide, please. This and still is, I believe, ongoing, but a phase 2 study of Keytruda, a Merck drug in patients with MSI tumors. Now, this is a very specific use. Keytruda actually has been approved prior to this clinical trial for use in certain cancers, but this particular trial was to test for genetic mutation efficacy, and indeed, I have the high MSI, and that's what they were looking for. So I joined this clinical trial on the recommendation of my doctor and began an every 2-week treatment process. On April 15th, I had my first treatment. Literally within weeks, I had immediate reduction in the blood markers for cancer, and on a surgical biopsy, which was scheduled for all trial participants, several months later, they literally found no evidence of the tumor in my ampulla. So for me, this immunotherapy drug was a miracle. I frankly wouldn't be here without it. You can see in this picture here, Dr. Lee and Dr. Diaz, who were the ones that led this trial, and Dr. Diaz, who's now at MSK, who really was the person who thought up the basis for this. I'm so grateful because I literally wouldn't be here. The picture that you saw in the prior slide is a picture of my daughter's wedding. My oldest daughter was recently married, Labor Day. I would not have been there without this clinical trial. 3 of my 4 daughters, including the oldest, who's now married, have Lynch syndrome as well. So to say that there's a relief to know that there's a drug that can potentially help them should they unfortunately contract cancer, which is more than likely going to be high MSI, as Lynch syndrome generally, the cancers that come from that are, is a wonderful feeling as a mother. But more importantly, I'm there to see it, and I'm there to be with them, and we are eternally grateful for what has been an amazing turn of events with a drug that is now completely approved by the FDA for use by anyone who has high MSI, regardless of where the cancer is. And as was mentioned, that is a complete breakthrough in the approach to cancer treatments that has recently begun. So thank you.
I'm sharing my webcam.
Thank you, Adrienne, for sharing that remarkable story, one we would hope we could see reproduced more and more often as we move forward. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. George Demetri, Chair of the AACR Science Policy and Government Affairs Subcommittee and member of the AACR's Board of Directors. Dr. Demetri is also a professor of medicine at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School and the co-director of the Ludwig Center at Harvard. Dr. Demetri is going to talk about medical research funding, taking your voice to Capitol Hill. Dr. Demetri.
Thanks a lot, Bill, and thanks again to everybody for joining. You've heard this remarkable progress in the fight against cancer from Mike first and now from a patient, Adrienne. And all of this was built on the basic science and the technology that's evolved because we've had such a strong ecosystem of medical research, funding, a pipeline of young investigators, and really crossing all of these sectors: academia, government, industry, philanthropic societies, the lay public and advocacy groups, payers, healthcare delivery systems, all of this. And AACR stands in the middle trying to integrate across all of this. And all of this really depends upon research that's driven by the curiosity of investigators to find new clues about cancer. And ultimately, the most innovative clues are funded not by industry, but by basic research at the National Institutes of Health, and for us specifically, the National Cancer Institute. If we're going to continue this kind of progress, and I think as Americans we have that can-do attitude, and we feel we must continue this, it's essential that the NIH and the National Cancer Institute continue to receive robust, sustained, and predictable funding from Congress. So let me talk to you a little bit about this because it affects everybody. A lot of the insights in cancer have applicability to many other diseases, including things like arthritis, including things like autoimmune diseases, inflammatory bowel disease, and eventually even neurologic diseases. So on this slide, you can see what's happened to the budget. Those big green bars, basically they're flat. It means not a lot of increase has happened except in the past 2 years. You see that very light green at the end, you can barely see it. Those are big increases that the Congress has given for federal funding of research. Now we're still way behind where we should be to have kept up with inflation. That's the blue line. And the area underneath that blue line and those green bars is what we've lost in the system. What we worry about is how many scientists haven't been able to ask great questions and how many people of great talent haven't even gone into science because they're worried as a country we may not be supporting it adequately. So you see, these are issues that really affect us and will affect the future. So we want to be sure we go in the right direction. Next slide. Now what's good is that there's a lot of momentum for medical research funding. In my role as chair of the AACR Science Policy Government Affairs Committee, I've had the privilege of working with AACR's Washington office and have met with a number of our leaders in Washington on both houses, the House and the Senate. And what we've heard from everybody, Republican or Democrat, independent, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter, is that there is very strong bipartisan support for the National Institutes of Health. And they're showing it by having these increases in their budgets. In fiscal year 2016 and 2017, Congress provided a $2 billion increase for the NIH, a 13% increase over these 2 years. And looking forward to fiscal year 2018, the House has approved, at least in concept, a $1.1 billion increase. And the Senate committee has approved the idea of a $2 billion increase. So this is where we've talked to our Congress people, and they say, look, not a lot's getting done in Washington. It's a challenging environment, but they see the value of cancer and medical research. Research against cancer really affects everybody in this country. And both liberals and conservatives agree this is a key economic driver in the country, as well as a key to our society to decrease eventually the costs of care, to get people working again. Look, you just saw Adrienne in an office in Manhattan, working mother. She's paying taxes. She's living a full and productive life. So you've got social good and economic good. That's what cancer research is about when we do it right. And we have the tools to do it more and more right. And Congress is saying they're willing to invest in these tools. And that's why all of you are watching today. As concerned citizens, we have to make our collective voices heard to say this is really not the time to turn our back on science, not to turn our back on other things that can come from the scientific investments we've made over the past 25 years and more in the war against cancer. So this momentum is clear. Last year even, we saw the 21st Century Cures Act and the Beau Biden Cancer Moonshot Initiative, which gives $1.8 billion over 7 years. It's not 1.8 billion times 7 years, it's distributed over 7 years. But these are ways of really delivering faster therapies to patients so that we hear more and more those kinds of stories like we just heard from Adrienne. And what we've also seen from the Beau Biden Moonshot Initiative is a coming together of various sectors, the private sector, the public sector, the academic sector, all of this trying to say we're on the same page, let's work together. A lot of these grants are really built not around giving money to one cancer center over another, but rather trying to get our cancer centers across the country to work together and to get our insurers and our healthcare delivery systems to share data so that we can actually have a bigger impact on our patients. Now, as we enter fiscal year 2018, we see a lot of opportunities. We know that the 21st Century Cure Act also helped create a funding mechanism for the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence, led magnificently by Rick Pazdur and a tremendous leadership team in the oncology FDA. And what we really need to do is ensure that continues to get its funding, because the FDA on the cancer side has always shown that they can break paradigms, continue to protect patients, and yet get breakthrough therapies like the CAR T cells, like the immune checkpoint inhibitors you just heard about, get these to patients in need, and then follow up on making sure that we as a country can improve the technology, make them more affordable, and make it work for our patients. So we want both well-funded, that's robust and predictable research endeavors, as well as the ability to get those things rapidly reviewed by the FDA for safety as well as efficacy. And we need a well-funded FDA to do that. The scientific opportunities are all there. The FDA sees it, the government sees it, the Congress, believe it or not, sees it. But they need your voice to show that you're in support of all this as well. We know that we see these paper-based proposals for increases, but we need to stay strong. And there are a lot of different pulls for federal funding. We want to make sure that Congress can reach a budget deal to lift the kind of caps that are still in place under the 2013 Budget Control Act and avoid anything that would prevent the federal government from really funding what they need to fund for these public goods that lead to benefits for virtually everybody in our society. So let's go to the next slide. Now, one thing that's clear is that not only lay people are affected, not only everybody we know, people in my family, people in all of your families, Adrian, as you've just seen, everybody has known somebody who's been affected by cancer, and that includes congressmen and congresswomen, senators, House of Representatives. I'll hold this up because you can request a hard copy of this book, The Cancer Progress Report. You just heard from Bill Nelson how to go to the AACR website and read it online or get a copy. I encourage you to do that because there are stories in here from Jamie Raskin, who's a representative from Maryland, talking about his fight, very successful, against colorectal cancer. And there are these patient stories that are very compelling. You have a representative from Pennsylvania as well, Charlie Dent, talking about how this research is widely recognized as important for the government. And all of the reps and senators we've talked to said it makes them feel good when their constituents ask for this because that's exactly what they want to do. They really feel like they're doing a public good and serving the country well by supporting this kind of research. There's not a single member of Congress whose life hasn't been touched by cancer. So reading this, you'll get a sense of a couple of people that are profiled in this year's Cancer Progress Report, but there are many, many others who have already publicly joined the fight against cancer. So let me share a couple of ways for you all to get involved. Next slide. You can sign up for the AACR advocacy resources here. There's an AACR Cancer Policy Monitor. It's a newsletter distributed bi-weekly to members. You get an idea of what's going on in Congress. We have a website that has an engage function to really keep our patients and our advocates, as well as our scientists, physicians, everyone else in the cancer community engaged. Clever name, but it makes sense. What's very clear is that your voice really does matter. People in Washington, although we're in kind of a negative mindset, people in Washington really do want to hear from their constituencies, and it makes a big difference. The AACR advocates have a Facebook group that's very powerful. Most disease-type organizations have Facebook groups or other kinds of groups that link people together. And AACR started a very novel program called the Scientist to Survivor program, where we match AACR scientists with cancer survivors and cancer thrivers, people who have been personally attacked by cancer and who are surviving it or who are thriving despite it. And it really gives a sense of, like the old maxim from Sims, a clothing company, that the educated consumer was their best customer. It's the same thing for advocates. The best advocates are those who are educated and really have the most to gain and to share by their stories. We really appreciate Adrian sharing her story with us today. Next slide, please. Here's some other advocacy resources. I won't go into this a lot. I do want to stress that Scientist Survivor program is held twice annually, and it's a wonderful way for patients and advocates to really get together and meet scientists that are in the AACR membership. AACR really likes to be the glue that brings together a lot of the different members of our ecosystem. So I encourage all of you to look into this. Next slide. On our Engage website, we have a lot of tools. You can sign up for how to get in touch with your elected officials. You can follow your congressperson on Twitter, and it'll give you tools to even do things like request a town hall meeting, set it up, request an in-district meeting, or write op-eds in your local paper. Those things are important as well. So I don't need to tell you, this is not a civics class. Believe me, I'm the last one, as our Washington office will tell you, I'm just learning about all this. But meeting these people in Washington, it is important to have your voice heard. Next slide. And so what we'd like to do is just encourage you to educate yourselves. We're here to educate. AACR is an educational organization as well as a research organization, and advocacy makes a difference. We're hearing from people whose lives were changed by new therapies. Cancer research is strong and only getting stronger, saving and really improving the lives of millions of patients across our country and across the world. So hope you'll join us as advocates for cancer research funding and join this community. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Dr. Dimitri. That was extremely instructive as a civics lesson. And now it's time to answer all of your questions. We can get started with some of the questions that you submitted when you registered for the webinar, and then we'll move on to some of those submitted today, and there have been a number of them that have. The first question I'd like to start with is, literally there's been a whole series of questions, a whole series of responses and curiosity about the evolving immune treatments for cancer, cancer immunotherapy. So this one I'd like to pose to Dr. Caligiuri. A number of folks are asking, why does it work so well when it works? And how much further do we have to go? Are there ways we're going to be able to build immune treatments for all people with cancer? What's the best science? What are the best scientific questions that we need to take on in the future?
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Let's just start with a little historical perspective. I think Sidney Farber was the first to give chemotherapy, like I said, 50, 60 years ago now, a single drug. And think about what we have now in terms of the armamentarium of chemotherapy over the last 50, 60 years. I mean, there's an abundance of chemotherapeutic agents, and with those agents, we've successfully cured many, many types of cancer and put many people into long-term complete remission. Targeted therapy, and then specifically in the question, immune therapy, are in their infancy. We've just now discovered how to wake up the immune system. And so the point is that we are, to answer the first part of the question, we're in infancy. There's going to be a lot more. This was one of the pillars in that diagram because it is going to be here to stay. And you're going to see a lot of cancer research centers across the country shifting their emphasis to immune therapy. And that brings up a really important point that Dr. Dimitri made. If we don't have the army, we can't cure the disease. There have been leagues of young individuals, and by the way, the three of us all know that they're the ones in the laboratory making the discoveries. We've had leagues of young individuals that have left the field and have moved on, and so we need to get that back, and funding will be very important. But yes, additional discoveries will be made. The net will be cast wider and wider as we learn about more and more of these, and excuse the expression, anesthetic agents that the tumors are secreting or have on their surface, and it will be up to our biotechnology colleagues to develop targeted therapies to these anesthetic agents that will further wake up the immune system. Why is it that some respond and some don't? Is the why they do is that we know we can identify the anesthetic agent, the molecule that's putting that particular tumor to sleep, and we've got a tool that can block it to wake up the immune system. And the other instances, it's very likely that a part of the tumor is putting it to sleep, but there are other part of the tumor that's making it grow is putting the immune system to sleep. But there are other things that maybe we think about building the vasculature, the angiogenesis, where we need to do more discovery. So yes, there'll be more advances. Yes, more research will be required. It is the molecules on the immune system that we already have discovered that we can then block and wake the immune system up.
So it does appear, of course, that one way that the immune system sees cancers so clearly is when they contain a lot of mutations, and that's just what Adrian Skinner described for us. I have a question for Adrian, which is, you talked about how you worked with your physicians at Memorial Sloan Kettering, your surgeon and your oncologist, to chart out a treatment course which involved clinical trial participation. And you took the bull by the horns yourself a little bit. What are your recommendations for other people confronting cancer like you did? How can they get involved in clinical trials the way you did?
So I had the very good fortune of a doctor, Dr. Eileen O'Reilly at Memorial Sloan Kettering, who had researched and had made an effort to have my tumor genetically tested. And the difference between the genetic testing that was done that determined my Lynch syndrome status versus the tumor genetic testing was significant. So by asking and getting the my approval to get the tumor genetically tested, she knew that I had high MSI, and she actually was the one that found this particular clinical trial. The fact that she recommended it, and I have complete trust in her because, you know, you have to have a doctor you trust when you're working with cancer treatments. This is life and death, absolutely. And when she said she thought this was the best course of action for me, I jumped into action. And, you know, to their everlasting credit, while I wasn't a sure bet for this clinical trial because of some of the parameters of my diagnosis, they took a chance on me, and I got lucky, and I got admitted into this clinical trial. I will say that since that time, I've spoken to a number of friends and people who have been referred to me, and I encourage them to look at all aspects of what's available to them. Clinicaltrial.gov is a database that has, I believe, clinical trials across the country listed, and you know, talk to your doctor. My doctor was able to point me in the right direction, and I believe that there are very many more clinical trials underway now. But I do know that this was the only thing that would have saved me because ampullary cancer is so invariably fatal. So I got lucky, and I'm glad I did it.
Well, it seems like so many of our survivors are such strong advocates for their own care that it's only natural when they become advocates for clinical trials across the country and the like. There's a series of questions that emerged that I think George Dimitri can take on particularly well. One was a question about what the broad-based, the magnitude of investment of the federal government in research, and even more nuanced, how much of that investment helps rarer cancers. In particular, somebody asked rarer cancers like sarcomas, but somebody else asked, what about children's cancers and the like that aren't as common as breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, and the like?
So I appreciate that. Let me just add to one thing that Adrienne said, which is a popular misconception, and her case shows it. Clinical trials are not a course of last resort. Very often clinical trials may be the very best possible thing to start with, and Adrienne is living proof of that. So I just want to get that out there because it is so important that patients are our partners in making the kind of progress against cancer that we see with Adrienne. But now specifically to your question about the magnitude of the federal government's investment in medical research. Again, medical research, the government's the biggest funder, right? 30 billion, higher than that amount of money, inconceivably large amounts of money. But when you spread that out across everything that it does, it's not just money in Washington, it's money that gets sent out across the country to all of the universities and funds curiosity-driven investigators at Seattle and San Francisco, San Diego, Iowa, Minnesota, you name it, across the country. And I think that's what even our Congress people don't often understand. How is this funding? If they fund the NIH, and the NIH has a beautiful campus in Bethesda, Maryland, you should all visit it someday. Actually, it's hard to get in because ever since TSA sprang up, it's actually harder to get in there because of security. But it is a very nice campus, but it is the minority of research that goes on in Bethesda. The majority of our federally funded research goes on at our universities and research institutes across the United States, and often in public-private collaborations. Now, your question asked about rare cancers, and thankfully, kids' cancers, pediatric cancers continue to be rare, but are very important because if you save the life of a child, that child has his or her whole life ahead of them. And we want to make sure that they live a productive, happy, and healthy life. So there's even more pressure on the research for children's cancers. And the answer to that is, what we're learning is that everybody's cancer is as unique as that person is as an individual. There are not going to be 2 breast cancers that are identical. There are not going to be 2 colon cancers that are identical. And so my field is sarcomas, a rare set of cancers, less than 1% of all cancers in the country. But we've learned a lot because there's 1,000 different kinds of sarcomas. No 2 people's sarcomas are the same. But that's going to be true in the common cancers too. No two lung cancers, no two prostate cancers. So we're learning the kind of lessons from these rare cancers that are ultimately going to be applied to all the cancers we deal with, as well as to other diseases. I bet this will come up in many other kinds of diseases, including the kind of autoimmune diseases that we're learning about as the converse of what we're learning from the immune system stimulation that's fighting cancer. Believe me, all the rheumatologists are looking at us and saying, wow, you're stimulating, and that's what you see. Maybe if we block it, we'll help other kinds of patients. So it's where cancer research and other research comes together.
So George mentioned that no two cancers are exactly alike, and there's been few things that have revealed that to us as convincingly as the genome sequencing of cancers that is ongoing at many different sites. And Mike Caligiuri, there have been a number of questions about how accessible is this technology to someone who's been diagnosed with a cancer? How should it be used? And we've already heard from Adrienne Skinner. She had this type of testing done, which aided her participation in a clinical trial. You mentioned how the AACR is trying to promote sharing of these data so we can learn more from it more quickly. What is the state of this as we get close to the point of care, close to the bedside?
Great question. Unfortunately, as of yet, sequencing by and large for patients is not free. It can be in certain clinical trials, as was mentioned by Dr. Dimitri, but by and large, one insurer or oneself has to pay for a specific panel of sequencing. In many, many instances, however, it is covered by insurance. So we talked about disparities. If you have insurance, in many instances, this kind of test for your mutations can be performed. What AACR Genie is doing is they're collecting all of those sequencing data, putting them in a common language, and depositing them in a public database so that they can be seen and shared by other clinicians and researchers. That's important because if I am able to sequence your tumor, what I want to know is who else has this particular tumor? We get back to the Amazon, if you will, where I can go to a database and find your particular mutation in 20 or 30 other patients, and then see how were you treated or how were you not treated and what worked best. Orion, the other, where Genie and Orion are beginning to partner now, Orion, the Oncology Research Information Exchange Network, does do the sequencing for free. It's free for patients, free for doctors, free for the institution. That is deposited in the database, and it can be a start and really help the clinician narrow down where the mutation might be and do additional testing. There are about 17 centers in the country that use Orion and can offer free sequencing. So there will likely be other instances like Orion where these types of opportunities become available. But right now, it's still restricted.
Another set of questions that's popped through, especially with all the new anti-cancer drug approvals and the like, is will some of these new treatments and the ones we hope to see in the next year, reported hopefully in the next Cancer Progress Report, will these be financially affordable by the general public even after they're FDA approved? George, take a stab at that.
You know, that's a huge concern of all of ours. We respect the fact that it is a big risk to put somewhere between $500 million and $1.5 billion on the line to develop a drug. There are varying stories about how much it actually costs to get a drug from discovery all the way to an FDA approval. And it's somewhere in that range. I actually do think it's around $1 billion. So that's a big ticket item. But if we're smarter, and that's where the technology comes in, if we're smarter, we can do it faster, and I bet we can do it more cheaply. The other thing is that there are a lot of pressures, as we've seen, on everybody, on personal amount of out-of-pocket costs. This is not a problem with the pharmaceutical industry, that's an insurance industry problem. That many more of the costs of even chronic expensive diseases like cancer are being pushed through to the individual families and patients. So these are issues that we as a society are going to have to deal with. Very rare cancers that have $500,000 costs, when you spread those costs out over 250 million people, it's actually not so much. But when you start talking about common cancers, we have got to, as a society, find different solutions so that we can actually afford it. I think all of us who are scientists, all of us who are citizens, are very concerned about this, but we need to work together as a society to find the answers. They're not easy. And the other thing is, we've heard about these CAR T treatments that are going to be $500,000. There are already some interesting approaches that Medicare has come to where if it doesn't work, you don't pay. So a little bit of a pay for performance action there on the part of the government saying to the manufacturer of this technology, don't you think it's fair that it has to work for that amount of money? After all, if you buy a Jaguar and it doesn't drive, you'd return it, right? You'd want your money back. So we're starting to see a lot of these things come into medicine in a way that everybody can understand. Not everybody needs a Jaguar, but heck, even if you buy a Hyundai or a Corvette, you know, you're going to need it to work. And that's the way we feel about the drugs.
This is Mike Caligiuri. Just one thing I might add is, and Dr. Dimitri made this point earlier, is that one of the things that need to be spread, if you will, amongst all of us, are the preventative strategies. You know, the cancers that are common become less common if we work hard to implement those strategies that you saw on the slide, such as smoking, obesity, sun exposure, diet, exercise. The cost begins to drop precipitously for society when there are many fewer cancers. And to think that, you know, half of global cancers are prevented with things like that I mentioned, as well as vaccines, is another way to attack the, quote, expense. And then finally, as Mary Lasker once said, if you think drugs are important, try disease. Cancer itself is into the T, not the M or the B, but the T, trillions worldwide in terms of what it costs. So developing smart preventative strategies that are relatively inexpensive is actually, in the long term, economically very, very beneficial to our society.
Well, it sounds like we're getting towards the end of this webinar series. We've heard some wonderful presentations. We've heard a lot about the progress made against cancer in the year 2017. We'll hear a lot about the progress made next year. It sounds like we have Drs. Caligiuri and Dimitri more or less on record suggesting we're going to make progress in immunotherapy, targeted therapy, genomics, and hopefully we'll be continuing to build new cancer treatments, new approaches to prevention as we move forward. And so I'd like to thank Dr. Caligiuri, Dr. Dimitri, Adrian Skinner for their remarks. The slides that they use in the presentations are in the handout section of the webinar. We'd be happy to send them to you along with a recording of the webinar. In the meantime, please feel free to read the Cancer Progress Report. It's really quite informative by going to www.cancerprogressreport.org. Also, the fall issue of Cancer Today is now available. This magazine is for patients, survivors, and caregivers, and it offers all kinds of resources for people confronting all different types of cancers. You can go to www.cancertodaymag.org to see the latest issue and an archive of previous ones. And finally, just after this webinar, you'll be invited to fill out the webinar survey. We really appreciate your feedback. And remember, we're going to try and get to some of the questions we weren't able to comment on during the live portion of the webinar via other correspondence back to you. So from all of us at the AACR, thank all of you for participating, and goodbye.